Hey everybody, my name's Cal, or Expanse. I'm the audio director here at Bitter Sales and also the audio mentor for the New Year New Skills Game Jam. I'm excited to get to talk to you guys today about some game audio stuff. So whether you're a solo dev or you're the audio team member, I'm hopeful that this will give you some really cool, some good information. Let's get right into it. First things first, let's talk about scoping strategies. So, what is scoping? Scoping is essentially taking inventory of the things that you need to do, comparing that to your timeline, your resources, and your ability, and then cutting that down into what can actually be done. You may have a list of 100 sounds that you want to make for your game, all that really nitty-gritty detailed stuff, but you only have a week to do it. You're dependent on those features getting put in the game and then your sounds getting put to those features. And you have to think if you even have the ability to get that many sounds done in that time frame and to the quality that you want. So say you decide you can only really do 20 sounds. Next, you're going to write down what those sounds are, any variations you might need for them, how important they are, and what they're for in something like a project management software like Trello, a simple spreadsheet, or even a message in Discord that you can work off of to track your progress. Now, you might be saying, okay, but how do I actually cut down that list from 100 to 20 sounds? How do I decide what is actually important and what I can kind of just do without? And my answer to you is that in general, your most important assets fully depend on the type of game you're making. However, you can generally group them in the following levels of importance. Number 1, music. Usually, no matter the game, no music makes things less captivating. Music helps pull the player in. It tells them how they should be feeling in that moment. And for a game jam, it really helps fill in the space where you didn't have the time to make more sound design assets. Number 2, player sound effects. Walking, attacking, dying, dashing, jumping, etc. Anything that's an action that your main character is doing needs a sound. It's what your player is going to be giving the most attention to, what they'll hear the most often, so your main character needs as much sound as possible. Number 3, enemy sound effects. Essentially the same as your player sound effects, but just, well, on your enemies. These should sound more intimidating than your player sound effects. They should also be different. Don't reuse your player sound effects for your enemies unless you absolutely have to. You can reuse enemy sound effects between enemies if you need to save some time, but you want there to be a clear distinction between your player and your enemy sounds without needing to rely on the visuals. Number 4, UI sound effects. This is your dialogue, your in-game interactions, your menu button sounds, all of those little things. These are really fantastic to have. They add a ton to your game in terms of polish, and they usually don't take too much effort. For example, you can make a single button click sound and reuse it for pretty much all of the menu buttons if you have to. You could make a single interaction sound effect and use it in-game for things like picking up an object or interacting with something like a door or a sign or a lever or a button or etc. and etc. But dialogue is where it gets a little bit tricky. The type of dialogue you want is going to determine the difficulty. You can get pretty crazy with this, but you don't really have to. I personally very rarely see dialogue sounds in Game Jam games just because they are very difficult to make and also implement if you don't know what you're doing. The more dialogue you have, the harder it gets. So I would say maybe only consider this if you have only a little dialogue, but if you have a very dialogue-heavy game, like a visual novel, for example, I would say to actually really take the time to make those dialogue sounds, because they kind of act as a player sound in that case. Like I said, this is where the type of game you're making is going to really determine this level of importance. But it's going to get a little bit tougher depending on the type of dialogue you want. If you do want to add some dialogue sound effects to your games, there is a few different ways that you could do this. Some games, like Dave the Diver, for example, have just like simple grunts for each character that are determined by the content of the message. If it's a positive message, it's going to have a positive grunt. If it's a negative message, it's going to have a negative grunt. Maybe they're unsure, or maybe they're excited, so on and so forth. Another way that you could handle dialogue sounds in your game is how Undertale or Animal Crossing handle their dialogue. This is where you have a typing-esque gibberish style. This style is kind of weird to implement from what I know. I've personally never implemented it, but I do know people that have, and it can get a little strange. From what I know, the reason it can get a little weird is because it's dependent on the length of your actual dialogue message. The sounds are kind of attached to the letters or like words themselves. But if that's the style you want, it might be worth putting in the effort to figure out how to implement that. But it is a pretty cool dialogue style. So if you like it, maybe it's worth it. The last and perhaps most obvious form of this is going to be fully spoken dialogue. So this is where you'd have a voice actor reading all of the lines and then either have that play along with the text, like in Hades, for example, or have no text, but I wouldn't recommend doing it without the text for a game jam. Number 5 is going to be environmental sound effects, essentially ambience and other background details. This is peak polish. It adds so much to your game. It really helps bring your player into the world of your game and just kind of make things feel complete. If you have time, I definitely recommend trying to get some environmental sound effects in your game, but it also doesn't affect gameplay and is instead just some of that nitty-gritty stuff that should be the first to get cut if you're in that time crunch phase. So to recap, the order of importance for this is going to change depending on your game. So talk it over with your team, figure out what's the most important for your gameplay, and focus all of your attention there first. Now you're going to take your scoped out list and you're going to actually present it to your team. You're going to want to make sure everyone is on the same page, make sure that all of the sounds that you've put together are actually the most important stuff. Make sure that you have a correct understanding of the planned features and the assets needed for those features. Just generally, you're just trying to avoid miscommunications. Now, getting into our second topic of this video, time management. Properly managing your time is just as important as having a proper scoping strategy. If you scope well but don't manage your time properly, you'll end up either failing to finish all of the things you wanted to accomplish, producing a much lower quality of assets due to rushing through everything at the end, or most commonly, a mix of both. So, how do you avoid this? Well, the first thing you should do after you scope out your assets is not open up your DAW and start working on sounds or your music. The first thing you should do is look at all of your scoped items and just create a schedule for yourself. You're going to want to base this schedule on your availability, the order of importance of your assets, and your ability as a sound designer. Be realistic with yourself. Get an idea of how long each asset is going to take you and plan it out. If things don't fit, cut them before you begin working on them and just add them back if you end up having time. You should also plan for having a day where you do nothing. This isn't a break day per se, but things can go wrong at any time. Sometimes things come up and you can't work on the jam for a day or for most of a day, or sometimes you even need to leave the jam early. Planning for that in advance is super helpful because it allows you more time for the most important stuff if you don't need to use that day, and it ensures that you're going to still be on track and getting things done as soon as possible if you do need to use that day. Now for our third topic, implementation. So implementation isn't something every person is going to be comfortable with, especially if you're new to game dev, game audio, or just implementation itself. And this is mainly because there are some prerequisites that you're going to need to understand to be able to do implementation properly. Number 1, you need to understand how to use version control. Usually if your team has more than one programmer, this is probably going to get set up immediately, but if you only have one programmer on your team, it may not get set up automatically while you're prepping everything for the jam. So if you do want to do your team's audio implementation, you're going to need to jump in with them in this process of setting up version control or encouraging them to set up version control, and just make sure that you're set up to be able to work in the project at all. Number 2, you need to know how your team's engine works. Not just how it works for audio, you need to know at minimum how to navigate through your team's engine, what language it uses, and how to read that language. Not necessarily how to fluently code in that language, but you do need to understand enough to know what's going on when you look at a script. You'll also need to know the lines of code that you'll be using depending on if you're using middleware or your engine's audio tools. In general, you don't need to know how to build a game in that engine, but if you don't know how to set up an audio system in your engine, you probably shouldn't be doing the implementation for it unless you already have an idea of how to do implementation in another engine. You kind of know the process and you can learn pretty quickly how to set it up in the engine your team is using. Number 3, you need to know if you even have the time to reliably implement everything you make. If you don't have the time to make and implement everything you need, you probably shouldn't do the implementation for your team unless you know you have another team member who could reliably pick up that slack. Now, if you're a solo dev, the process is going to be a little bit different for you than if you were just an audio team member who's also doing the audio implementation. For my solo devs out there, I recommend that you get an audio system set up and running in your engine pretty much as soon as possible. If you don't already know how to do that, I recommend just looking up some very simple YouTube tutorials for your engine on how to get everything set up and working. And then as you're adding in features, get it all prepped so that you can just drop an asset in, but don't start working on the actual assets yet. Get it to a point where you have a bunch of features fleshed out, everything is ready, they're just missing the actual sound, and then go and maybe make a batch of assets and then drop them in, and then just kind of repeat that process based on whatever your timeline is. Now, if you want to do your team's audio implementation, first decide whether you're going to use middleware or if you're going to use your in-engine tools. But what actually is middleware? Essentially, middleware is an external audio engine. So instead of having to control all of your parameters via scripting in your internal audio engine, middleware is a software that allows you to control all of those behaviors kind of in the actual software, set up things like randomization or looping without needing to script those behaviors, and then you just kind of code in the actual event to play, but you don't need to code in the behaviors themselves. But it's important to keep in mind that because middleware is kind of that external engine, it's going to use different scripting commands than your engine's in-engine audio tools. So make sure that you know what those commands are. I recommend watching a few YouTube tutorials on how your middleware and your engine interact, as it does depend on what engine you're using. If you want to use middleware, I personally suggest starting with Fmod if you're a beginner. It's much more beginner friendly. It has a ton of great features to keep you organized. Wise is another very popular middleware, but it's a lot more front load heavy. It kind of just throws everything at you all at once. And so it can be a little bit overwhelming if you don't really know what you're doing or don't have any experience with middleware. Though Wise does have some good courses to help get you acquainted with it, I would suggest learning those outside of the Game Jam timeframe, as they can be a little bit time consuming. And if you don't have enough knowledge going into it to know how it works, it is probably just going to be better to do either Fmod or the in-engine tools. Now, that's all I'm going to talk about in this section. I'm not going to get super in-depth with how implementation works, but if you do have a technical question or just a question about middleware or anything else that we talked about so far in this video, please do feel free to reach out through the Mentors Help area, and I will do my best to provide you with either a straight answer or find a resource that you can use to help solve your problem. Now, for this next section, I'm going to be discussing kind of my process when it comes to making music for a game jam setting. If you don't already know how to make music, I do not recommend trying to learn within the time frame of this game jam. For instance, if you are a solo dev, please just reach out to a composer and try and get them to make some music for your game, or look for some royalty-free music assets that you can make work. The first thing I do is talk with my team to get an understanding of the mood of the game. Usually this happens immediately after the jam starts, but sometimes it does happen again if we need to pivot or something like that. The next thing I'll do is gather some references. This can either be specific, like links to songs or soundtracks that I want to pull inspiration from, or it can be a little bit more general, like just having an idea of the genres that I want to influence this music that I'm making. To know what to look for, I usually use a mix of the game's intended mood and the planned art style, because I like making sure that the music matches the visuals very well, and it just all gels together. Next thing I do is I make a very short style demo for the game based on the references that I collected. This is usually just me making a template and kind of compiling the instrumentation that I want to use, getting an idea of how I want the music to sound overall, and just making sure everything is working together to convey the right mood. This is usually like 30 seconds long. It's a really rough mix. It's just enough to convey my idea and kind of get my thoughts down, kind of like an audio sketch. Then I'll show that to my team and just make sure everyone agrees with it and that we're heading in the right direction, get feedback and things like that before moving on. The next thing that I do is I take the style demo and I just flesh it out into the main gameplay track. Usually I'll end up using a lot of the bones of the style demo for the track and just kind of add on to it to make it longer and adjust some instrumentation, things like that. But if it's working well, I usually lean on the style demo pretty hard and just make sure that the general vision stays intact and that I don't get too carried away. For my main gameplay loops, I usually build them specifically to be a very large loop, about 1 minute to 2 minutes long. That way there's enough content to stay interesting to the player and also to have a good flow from beginning to end so that when it loops back around, it's not super obvious. Once the main gameplay loop is done compositionally, I'll show it to the team and just make sure everything is good before moving on to the final mixing and mastering stage. Then, once the main gameplay music is done completely, I'll do the exact same process just for the menu music. Usually for the menu music, I go through all of the steps, but make it much shorter. Usually it's in a different key. Sometimes I reuse elements from the main gameplay track. Other times it'll be a completely different track, just using the same instrumentation from the style demo. The main goal here is just to make something that entices the player to continue. It gets them to understand what the mood of the game is before even pressing play, and just to generally get them prepared for the game's experience. Because most of the game jams I do are about 72 hours, I don't normally make more music than this, but if you did want to add more tracks, you would just continue to follow this cycle for all of the different tracks that you need. Next up, we're going to talk about some sound design tips. So this section is going to be a lot more solo dev friendly than the music section, because there's a lot of ways that you can make custom sounds without needing to know all of the theory behind everything. First things first, get access to some good libraries. You don't have to spend a fortune. If you're willing to do some digging, you don't even have to spend anything at all. Personally, I recommend a library like Soundly or Epidemic Sound, which also has royalty-free music. That way you can get access to a bunch of high quality sounds for a pretty reasonable price. If you're more sound design focused or you just want to get more in depth with things, I personally recommend Soundly. That's what I use day to day. But if you're more needing some quick and polished stuff that you're not going to have to do too much to, I recommend Epidemic Sound. Plus, again, it has some royalty free music, which is always a plus. But if you just need something free, I recommend freesound.org. If you're willing to do some digging, it can be such a great resource. There's lots of stuff on there that users have recorded and uploaded straight to the site. Some of it is okay, some is great, and some is pretty bad. You just have to comb through and find what you need, but if you're willing to do that work, it's a great resource. Now, if you're a solo dev or someone that just hasn't worked with audio before, you probably don't have a DAW or a digital audio workstation, so you're going to want to make sure that you get one of those. What that is essentially software where you can do things like compose music, do some audio editing, put together your sound effects, all of that stuff. There are plenty of great options out there. I personally use Reaper, but if you've never used a DAW before, it can be a little bit daunting. But if you're willing to learn how to use it, it's very, very awesome. It has a great free trial. It's also industry standard if sound design is something you wanted to pursue in the future. But if you just wanted something very simple and completely free, Audacity is also a great choice. Now, when you're designing sounds for a game, very often you're going to be designing sounds to an animation. And so just to make sure that you're lining everything up correctly, that you have the timing right, you should ask your artist to either export their animation as a video or go into your engine if the animation is already in there and just get a screen capture of the animation playing. Then you're just going to pull that video into your DAW and just have it playing while you're working on the sound so that everything is lined up, and when you export it, you don't have to worry about trying to go back and adjust it to make sure everything is lined up and synced. One of the funnest parts of the sound design process is getting to record your own sounds. It's a blast. I highly recommend it if you have a specific idea of what you want and you have the means to create it yourself. Especially when it comes to human sounds like talking or grunts or snapping or like mouth putters or sounds and things like that. Finding those specific sounds, even the best libraries, can be super tedious. So sometimes it's better to just record it yourself and just kind of spend the time working with it to get it right instead of digging through a sound library for hours for something you might never find. So if you do want to record your own stuff, there's a few things that you're going to need. First, you'll need a microphone. XLR-based mics are best, but if you only have a USB mic, that's also okay. Just kind of work with what you have. You'll also want to make sure you have a super quiet room. If your room is super echoey, my recommendation is to try recording in a closet if you can, and that way you can use clothes, blankets, pillows, etc. to just kind of dampen that sound and make that space as dead as possible. If that's not possible for you though, draping a blanket over your head and over your mic if you're doing something like a human sound, that's also can be a good option. If you've never recorded your own sounds before though, I do recommend looking up some YouTube videos on some basic recording principles just so you can get comfortable with the idea. Or if you don't have the means to record your own stuff, stick to the libraries that you have access to for now. Another thing you should keep in mind when designing sounds for your game is the frequencies of the sounds you're using. You want to avoid having lots of sharp sounding sound effects in your game, as you'll wear out the player's ears the more that they hear them. This makes it less enjoyable for them to play the game, meaning they'll either turn sound effects off or just completely close out of your game. Using high frequencies occasionally to draw players' attention is fantastic. A good example of this is with a player attack sound, say a sword. You don't want to emphasize a ton of the high frequency metallic layers, you want to emphasize the movement of it as it whooshes through the air, and just generally make it as easy on the ears as possible. This is because the player will hear this sound a ton throughout your game. With an enemy, however, like we talked about before, you want your player to be able to differentiate themselves from the enemy by sound alone. Adding high frequency elements to emphasize the danger of enemy attacks is a great way to utilize them. This leads us to our next point, one of the most important concepts in sound design for games: player feedback. What is player feedback? Basically, it's what we were talking about, the idea that the player should be able to recognize what something is by its sound alone. Because the player can't look everywhere at once, having audio cues that tell the player what's happening is vital for gameplay. A great example of this is how friendly versus enemy sounds are handled in Overwatch. If you have the same character on your side and on the enemy side, and they both play the same ability, you want to be able to hear if it's the enemy or your teammate in case you need to protect yourself. The way they handle this is by having the characters have different dialogues depending on if they're on your team or not. This creates a correlation in the player's mind so that they're able to defend themselves as needed. The most obvious example of this in Overwatch is with ultimate abilities. Ultimates from your teammates are going to be heard in whatever language you have set as your game's language. For me, that's English. But ultimate abilities from the enemy are going to be heard in the character's native language. This, on top of different dialogue options, makes it very easy to discern whether or not you're in danger. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about when designing sounds for games is variations. Variations are essential for video game sound design. The more often a sound is heard, the more variations you should have. My general rule of thumb is that nearly every sound should have a minimum of 3 variations. There are plenty of ways to make variations, but here are some basic ideas. 1. Try adjusting the rhythm of your sound. What does that mean? Basically, if your sound has multiple layers, shift them around to give it a little bit of a different order of things. Have a different emphasis on a different part of the sound. Of course, keep it within the animation's time frame, but adding that different emphasis or even adding new layers or taking layers away can be a great way to kind of switch things up. You can also stretch out or shrink individual layers to slow them down or speed them up respectively. Number 2. Adjust the pitch of your sound. Don't just grab all of your layers and shift them up or down by the same amount. Of course, if you only have one layer, such as if you pulled a sound from a library and didn't want to do anything extra to it, then yeah, of course, you'll just be shifting the entire sound up or down in pitch. But if you have multiple layers, pitch shifting them by different amounts is a great way to make it sound different, but not just have that obviously pitch adjusted sound. Number 3. Use both of these concepts together. Adjusting the rhythm and adjusting the pitch of your different layers for your sound is a really great way to create a lot of different types of variations. So if you need more than 3, it's going to give you a lot more flexibility than if you were just pitch shifting the entire sound or just switching up the emphasis a little bit. Now, that's pretty much it for this video. I didn't want to touch on anything too technical to avoid making this video super long, but if you do have technical questions or questions on this video or need some specific help or just kind of anything else audio related, please feel free to reach out to me in the sound and music section of the Bitter Sales Mentor area, and I will be happy to give you some resources, to give you some help, give you some feedback, whatever you might need. Thank you so much for watching this video and for participating in the New Year New Skills Game Jam. I really hope that you learned some really cool stuff in this video, that maybe I got your mind jogging a little bit for the sound design for your game, or maybe even gave you some helpful tips for your music. There will be a list of resources in the description of this video for you guys to check out if you so choose. If you guys have any other resources related to this video, please throw them in the comment section down below. I would love to check them out, and I'm sure other people would too. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with for this game jam, and I really can't wait to see the awesome sound design and music that are going to be in your games.